While many Canadians were distracted by all the noise surrounding the Liberal leadership race, also Canada's most important financial institution released some critical information, including a warning for Canadians that a trade war with the US could have far wider reaching impacts on average Canadians than we even previously thought, putting the banks between a rock and a hard place, forcing them to make some pretty serious compromises that will end up affecting the lives of every single Canadian. Because over the past couple of years, well, there's one financial phenomenon that has most worried our economists and our bankers. But some recent developments have actually made this risk a lot more likely. Let me show you what I'm talking about. This phenomenon is called stagflation, and you've probably heard of it before, but here's a quick recap. It's basically a smashing up of two words together, stagnation and inflation, both which can be issues in the economy. Stagnation refers to, well, an economy that's not growing, an economy that's stagnating. We would generally measure this as our GDP, whether or not that's going up at a regular tick, or if it's flatlining, or in some cases even going down. Inflation, you've heard of this before. There's different types of inflation. But the one we're talking about here is consumer price inflation, the one that you've probably experienced over the past few years, where it seems like the price of everyday goods and services is just going up and up. Now, each of these is an issue on their own, but when you mix them together, it makes for a type of perfect storm that the banks have a hard time dealing with. The risk of this stagflation hitting Canada has gone up over just the past few weeks, and we'll get into exactly why that is. But first, I have to explain why it's such a big problem, especially for Canada's central bank, that's the Bank of Canada. And it's largely because the tools that they have to impact the economy, well, they aren't really well adjusted for dealing with a situation where we're experiencing stagflation. Let me show you why. The Bank of Canada is sort of like the bank for the big banks in Canada. They do a bunch of different things, but their main mandate, the thing that they were created to do, and the thing that the government says, hey, this is the only thing that you're supposed to be focusing on, is to keep inflation at 2%. This is their mandate. They target 2% inflation because they've decided that this is the appropriate amount of inflation to allow for the economy to function as we expect it to. So if inflation gets above 2%, well, it's the Bank of Canada's job to bring it down. And if inflation gets below 2%, well, then they'll view it as their job to bring inflation back up to within the 1% to 3% range that they're targeting. And they have a bunch of different tools that allow them to do this, tools that allow them to manipulate the Canadian economy to serve this end goal. The first is their policy rate. They can set interest rates, QE and QT. These are more extreme actions that they can take usually in times of crisis, but that might be changing here shortly. We'll get into that in a second, as well as forward guidance where they sort of tell the economy what's going to happen so that the economy will act in a certain way. But the most impactful of these tools that the Bank of Canada has is the ability to impact interest rates, because it turns out that when you change interest rates, well, that does have a big effect on the end inflation rate that we end up seeing in the economy. And it's actually a lot more simple than they would have you believe, or than most people would have you believe. By changing interest rates, the Bank of Canada can either slow or speed up the economy. It makes sense, right? If you have lower interest rates, it costs less to borrow, and more Canadians are incentivized to borrow. Now, that results in businesses borrowing more to expand, which grows the economy. It results in those businesses expanding, hiring more people. Those people end up making more money. Wages can tend to go up. And at the same time, individual consumers who can take out loans, be that for a car or a house, well, they're more likely to do so for the very same reasons, right? It's cheaper to borrow, so there ends up being more spending, more demand in the economy, more people buying things, and that ends up pushing up the inflation rate because businesses with more demand can raise the prices of things. And of course, the inverse is true. If you have higher rates, well, then it's more expensive for people to borrow, more expensive for people to spend. Businesses tend to shrink, and a knock-on effect of that is that, well, when those businesses shrink, so too does the value of those companies, which results in their stock prices going down in some cases, and people who hold those stocks feeling a little less wealthy and maybe being less willing to spend. We see this with house prices as well. When it becomes more expensive to borrow, well, house prices tend to come down because fewer people can afford to take on the debt to purchase those homes. problems. So I've made this little chart here to make it clear. When the Bank of Canada uses one of its tools, which is changing the policy rate to increase or decrease interest rates, well, that has some effects, right? We increase rates, that will tend to slow the economy, but as a benefit, and this is what they've been doing over the past couple of years until just recently, it reduces inflation. It fights against inflation. Fewer people spending, that means that there is less demand in the economy, and that supply-demand balance, well, it changes, right? Same goes for when you decrease rates, that boosts the economy, but it does risk increasing inflation, right? Sometimes that will be their goal if they're below the inflation target, but in a lot of cases, they're doing this to boost the economy and are risking inflation coming into the picture when they do so. Now, these tools can end up being very, very impactful, but these tools also aren't very well suited to this stagflation situation because they don't have precise enough a way to impact the individual things that these tools do without risking the downsides of it. And this is exactly what the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tony Gravel, said in a recent speech. In fact, I think that this was just yesterday. Why don't you listen to this, and then we'll talk a little bit more about, why it's more likely that stagflation is going to hit us and why the Bank of Canada could be kind of screwed by it and how that all impacts you.
So there's likely to be inflation impact as the same time that we have a slowdown in the economy. So that puts a central bank in a very complicated space.
In this clip, he talks about how, well, the Bank of Canada gets put into a rough position if we see stagflation. And the reason that stagflation is at the top of everyone's minds right now is because of these recent threats about a trade war developing between Canada and America. You see, if we respond with tariffs as America threatens to tariff Canada, well, the result is that we could end up paying more for goods in Canada, and that could have an inflationary impact. Now, that is kind of to be expected when there's tariffs that are being applied, but at the same time, while we're experiencing this inflation from the tariffs, well, also we're experiencing a stagnating economy, one that isn't growing as quickly as we'd like it to, if at all. This would be really hard for the Bank of Canada to deal with. I mean, think about it. They only have limited tools, and that's largely to impact interest rates. But if we have a situation with stagflation where there's high inflation and a slow economy, well, then neither of these tools, a rate increase or a rate decrease, really fits the bill. You could tackle it with a rate increase. Well, this would possibly reduce the inflation that we'd be seeing, but at the same time, it would slow the economy, which would be the inverse of what we'd want to do, since we already have a slow economy. Well, okay, think of it the other way. What if we were to decrease rates? Well, that could solve the stagnation of the economy because lower rates would boost the economy, but at the same time, that does risk increasing the inflation that in a stagflationary environment we would already be seeing. So essentially, the Bank of Canada is between a rock and a hard place here, and that's why they're doing all that they can to try to avoid a situation like this. So what could the bank do in this situation? Well, in this same lecture and interview, the host asks if the Bank of Canada would use QE, which is an economy-stimulating policy tool that the Bank of Canada can use to create new money in the system to further spur on economic growth, albeit with some negative side effects. Now, he responds to this question of would we use QE again with, well, it depends. Listen to this.
And it really depends on three key things. There's other assumptions that go into it, but there's three key things that to understand. If the size of the tariffs that the U.S. would impose on our exports, and the breadth. If Canada retaliates with their own tariffs, and this third one's maybe less discussed. What do both countries do with the tariff income? Does it get recycled back to consumers and businesses? Or does it go down to pay down debt? That also has an important impact on the economy. So clearly, a tariff on our exports is detrimental for our exports. So that'll have a big negative impact on economic growth in the first round effects. To the extent there's retaliation, that'll have offsetting effect on the goods we consume upwards. So there's there's likely to be inflation impact as the same time that we have a slowdown in the economy. So that puts a central bank in a very complicated space.
So he says, well, maybe we'll use our policy tool of QE, but that's kind of an extreme thing to do. But maybe we'll see. Now, in my eyes, that doesn't make a ton of sense. If you need to stimulate the economy, they would probably first lower interest rates and then possibly implement this quantitative easing. And by the way, this is really interesting because in this same speech, he talks about the normalization that the Bank of Canada is going to be doing of their QE-like activities, purchasing bonds from the Government of Canada with created money in their reserve accounts at the Bank of Canada. It's a little bit complex, but we're going to be covering it in a future video, so subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. It doesn't cost you a dime. It doesn't sign you up for anything. It only helps me and this channel, so I appreciate you doing that. Thanks so much for doing that, I'll update you with exactly what's going on there on that bond situation. But all this to say, he doesn't rule out QE, that quantitative easing, money printing. But if we believe that the bank's primary goal is 2% inflation, and that is truly what they're only thinking about, QE is hard to use in a stagflationary environment for the same reasons I just talked about. This stimulates the economy, which helps the economy grow, yes, but it also could bring back inflation to a higher degree. And if we're seeing stagflation already, well, then we already have inflation at a higher level. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but he nonetheless reiterates that that 2% target is the Bank of Canada's primary goal.
But the thing is, at the end of the day, our mandate, our monetary policy mandate, will still say the same. So we'll aim to achieve our 2% inflation target, whatever comes our way. And then we'll have to manage our policy decisions after we understand exactly the details of whatever is going to be announced. But at the end of the day, to the extent that we need to target 2% inflation rate, we'll do what we need to do to get us there.
So he continues to reiterate that this 2% target is the main thing at the top of mind for the Bank of Canada. But honestly, given what's happened over the past 4 years, I question how true that entirely is. We've seen a history of, especially in times of crisis, the Bank of Canada tending to abandon this target to serve other interests, to do things that they determine that they need to do. We look back throughout the pandemic, and the Bank of Canada did incredible stimulative policies, right? They lowered interest rates to essentially zero, and they printed hundreds of billions of dollars to prop up the economy after it had to be shut down during the pandemic. Now, this largely resulted in the inflation that we saw reaching upwards of 8.5%, I believe. But even prior to that 8.5% inflation, we saw massive asset price inflation, which was incredibly damaging for a lot of Canadians. We saw house prices rip as a result of that cheap money and money flowing into the system. Now, that doesn't just hurt people in terms of the consumer price inflation, but also in terms of their life and their life trajectory. If you can no longer afford a home because of these incredibly stimulative policies, well, then there's a big social impact that has as well. So like last time, if we saw economic stagnation and fragility in the markets, well, would the Bank of Canada then abandon its 2% mandate to once again do quantitative easing, all the while risking asset and consumer price inflation? Would they just do what they did during the pandemic? Well, I think that maybe they could, right? Because to this day, they don't truly take credit or take responsibility or accountability for the negative side effects of their monetary policy during the pandemic. They'll continuously point to supply chain disruptions, as well as the war in Ukraine, as the reason we saw that inflation in late 2021 and early 2022, instead of the massive money printing that went on behind the scenes. It probably is a mixture of the two, but it's a little disingenuous that they don't take accountability for their role here. And I think that does leave the door open for them to do a similar sort of thing in the future. Who knows what what external factor they could pin this future inflation on. Perhaps they could implement this policy and say, well, actually, all of the inflation that you're seeing now is a result of the actions of Donald Trump, America, and the tariffs that we've been forced to retaliate with. A totally external thing from the Bank of Canada. Don't look at the man behind the curtain. It's hard to know for sure, and there's a lot of things changing when it comes to monetary policy these days, specifically with the Bank of Canada, and specifically from this speech, which I'm still doing research on. So keep your eyes out for more content on that. But it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen in the future. Will these tariffs even come into play? Who knows? But what can you do to prepare yourself? And I talk about this almost every single video. We saw that when there are times of crisis, the way that these banks operate, right? They tend to do things that tend to increase the value of assets while devaluing the value of cash. So I always say focus as much as you can on reducing your expenses and trying to increase your income so that you can start investing as much as you can, because it's these assets that you can purchase, these investments, that tend to retain their value even when the currency is losing its value. So that's generally what I tend to point people towards, even if we don't know when or where this will happen or why it will happen. In my eyes, I think it's just a matter of time before this kind of policy happens again, whether it's due to the tariffs or some other black swan event that could happen over the next 5 years. But I'm curious what you think about all of this. So what have I gotten right and what have I gotten wrong? Is the Bank of Canada taking the appropriate steps to prepare for the future, or maybe are we going to go around for another spin of all of this? I'm curious what you think. Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the channel. It only helps me out and doesn't cost you a dime, so I appreciate that. Subscribe to the email newsletter. That's the first link in the description, where you can get all of the sources for all of the videos that I put out from now and into the future. So check that out. And with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.